Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sathology, Debunking Mythology. And we are on this show again discussing the ancient history. And in the ancient history today, we are going to cover and also debunk. Generally, it is said that Hindus have never fought outside the country. Hindus are a weak community. It's a general impression also. Even in the USA, when they talk about Indians, it's generally they are considered very peaceful. It's a good image to have, very peaceful, very controlled, and mostly into meditation and yoga. That is the image, general image. And the professions also, we have seen that we have chosen to be a doctor, engineer, highly educated people. But there is another aspect of the rich history of India where Indians have defended every single invader to their land, which is probably not taught in the history books. And we had one show earlier on war strategies by Marathas. And we have a very good friend and an author of the book. And so I would like to welcome Anish Gokhale.
Yeah.
Yeah, Namaskar, Anishji. How are you?
Yes, very good morning, everyone. Morning, good evening, wherever you are.
So, Anishji, one of the things which is a big misinformation being spread in the Indian textbooks and also taught by the Western authors that Indians do not have the capacity to fight back. And probably that's the cue which Pakistan and China took repeatedly to attack India. And we have seen that Indian politicians also saying the same thing again and again. They lose more territory than they gain, or if they gain anything by through military, they give it back on the negotiation table. So how true is that history? Do you think there is a record that Indians have not fought back properly?
That's totally false to say that we never fought back. In fact, the first invasion, which you know from the West, uh, except the ones that were carried out by the Hunas or the Greeks and all these pre-Christianity era invasions. In fact, if we take the medieval era, because basically this, when you're talking about that Indians never fought back, it usually alludes to the medieval era from the time of Muhammad bin Qasim and further on up to the entry of the Europeans. So we can in fact find that right from the time that this Muhammad bin Qasim invaded in 712 AD, only 20, 30 years later, we had an alliance that stretched from what is today's Kashmir all the way to South India up to Andhra Pradesh. All the kings who made up the western border of the country, right from Jammu and Kashmir down through Rajputana, Gujarat, and even south through Maharashtra to Andhra Pradesh, they formed an alliance and they kept out this Arab invasion and limited it to west of the Indus. So 712, we find that Sindh has gone to Muhammad bin Qasim, but it's not Sindh actually. It is some parts near the Indus. And this is actually the era of Bappa Rawal. Bappa Rawal from Rajputana. We also have Mir Bhoj of what is today's Malwa, and it is his inscription of the 8th century. There is a Gwalior inscription of the 8th century AD, which talks about this battle which took place in 735 or 736 AD against Junaid. And this battle basically united the kings of North India, Bappa Rawal, Mihir Bhoj of Malwa, and even south we had Vikramaditya and his ally known as, or in fact his provincial governor known as Pulakesin. And he was the governor of a province called Lata, which is today in Gujarat. So they together formed an alliance and they kept out this invasion and threw it back uh, west of the Indus, where the Arabs established a small uh, municip- a small trading outpost, which is today the Pakistani city of Mansehra. So we find that this is a situation in 735 AD, and the next invasion that actually happens is that of Muhammad Ghaznavi, which is in 1025 AD. So the next attack that Gujarat faces is 3 centuries later. In between, you have this Balochistan and Afghanistan slowly disappearing under the invader. But then again, you're seeing 300 years, a long time. Further on, there are continuous efforts at stopping invaders. You'll find that Maharashtra and these parts of South India are attacked only in the late 13th century, that is 1296 AD. More or less the same time, about 50 or 90 years before that, you have an entry into Bengal. But then, even after Bengal is breached in 1206, you will see that Assam continues to stay independent for about 5 centuries after that, and even Orissa manages to hold off invaders till about 1568 AD, when Kalapahad finally manages to overthrow the Hindu rulers in that region. So all said and done, in fact, all this when we say that invaders ruled for about 800, 900 years is totally false. What you're talking about is, in fact, the whole of the country. We're talking about Kashmir to Kanyakumari. This entire country went under foreign rule for a total period of only about 150 years. And some or the other part was always fighting and coming out of this foreign rule. In fact, with the exception of Sindh, which has this foreign rule right up to 1843. The 1843 is when actually it went from the Amirs of Sindh to the British government directly. One of those rare places which did not have a Indian ruler replacing the earlier Mohammedan ruler. Most other places, the old Mughal rule had been destroyed and replaced with the Rajputs or the Marathas or the Ahoms or the Sikhs, whichever place you are in, or the local Rajas who had given up them. Sindh and Balochistan more or less the only places which continued their old rulers. And so basically you find that very short span of time actually is having the entire country under foreign rule.
So one of the biggest misconceptions, and which is being taught in the universities, is that the Hindus have always been slaves and of others, and which you have correctly debunked it in terms of that is just a folklore or mythology. But many Indian authors continue also. So it's a very classical case of Western academics. They go by the Indian Indian historic records. Every other country in the world, including countries like Vietnam or Thailand or even Burma, they have removed everything of British history or anything of invasion because they want their people to grow up to be proud. So generally, if you see a normal student, a 10th grade student in those countries and compare with the 10th grade student of India, the confidence level of those other students are very high because they have very high, since you are in merchant navy, you know what I'm talking. You see the same level, the knowledge of an Indian student may be higher, but the confidence of the other guy will be higher. And we see that wherever the history is not taught, that is a result. It directly affects the identity of people. And in those countries, particularly in Vietnam, they don't teach you that Americans invaded them. They teach you how Vietnamese defeated Americans. That's what they teach in their textbooks. And so the people who come out from the schools now, they're proud of it. They don't. So when they come to meet Americans, the confidence level is as much high because probably it is the only country which defeated USA in a straight war, not terrorism, nothing, in a straight war. So not correct, not telling the right history or telling mythology or a fake news to children creates an identity crisis. So in your historical records, in your book which you have written, what type of incidents are there in a war, strategies that were used by the Indian Maratha kings that can be a real inspiration to the students generally?
So my book is called Battles of the Maratha Empire, as we know it. And so basically I'm talking about warfare techniques right from the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji to the end of the Maratha Empire, which happened in 1818, and then a bit further on 1857, which also had a bit of vestiges of this, which are already past Maratha Empire. And instead of just being a description of all various personalities, I've actually put it into different battles which were pivotal and game changing, and which really affected the history or the turn of events. So you have Chhatrapati Shivaji, and in fact, one of the best essays I read on Chhatrapati Shivaji is by a person called Professor Narhar Kurundkar, late Narhar Kurundkar. And actually, it was supposed to be preface for a book, Marathi book, which came out about 30, 40 years ago. But there's a beautiful English translation of it also available now. One of the most pertinent points that he makes is that he says it is not as if Hindu powers before Chhatrapati Shivaji were not winning any wars or battles. But in Chhatrapati Shivaji's case, we see that it is not just, but before Chhatrapati Shivaji, we see that whether it is winning or losing, it is the Hindu powers territory which was defined. Either he used to face the invasion, and if he lost, then obviously then that was the end of the story. If he won, then that would mean that the status quo is maintained and the border stays where it is, and a defeated army provides some tribute and goes back. And barring a few exceptions, yes, this is the case in many of the battles which have taken place. There are exceptions, such as those in Orissa, where the kings actually went and raided territories to the west, which was the Deccan Sultanates, and to the north was the Nawab of Bengal. But more or less, we do see this is the situation that once the defeated party has gone back, the border has remained the same. Chhatrapati Shivaji's case, we see that he manages to impose a cost on the invading party. Every time he's attacked, we find that the reply is in imposing costs on the defeated Mughals or Bijapur or whoever is the invader. You find that Afzal Khan is invaded in 1659, and the result, or that is the reply of Shivaji Maharaj, is to invade Kolhapur itself and double his own territories. We find that when the Shaista Khan has invaded Pune, Shivaji's reply is to invade Surat, which was Mughal territory at the time. When Diler Khan invades the Deccan territories, Shivaji Maharaj bides his time, but 5-6 years later, he manages to invade what is then the Mughal province of Kalyan and Nashik and increase his sway all the way till there. Now, this is one aspect of his life. Further on in the history, we find that there are many techniques which are actually popular elsewhere in other warfare books, but the same techniques when employed by Indian rulers, by Indian warriors or commanders are hardly heard of. Case in point is a technique known as scorched earth. So people who have read about Napoleon, read about Napoleon, will know that this is a technique that was employed by the Russians to stop the French army. And it is usually taken as the start of the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, where he managed to trudge all the way to Russia, conquer everything in its way. And what the Tsar Alexander did was to set Moscow on fire. Napoleon thought that I'm going to reach Moscow, find sufficient supplies in Moscow, find all the places to rest his army, wait out the winter, and then complete his dream of toppling the Tsar of Russia. But the Tsar of Russia, instead, what he did was that he set Moscow on fire, evacuated the city, all the supplies were taken out, grain was set on fire, the buildings which could provide any kind of shelter to an army as large as Napoleon's were actually bombed. And the end result was that Napoleon was caught in a really bad situation in Russia where he had no supplies, he was facing the cold weather, he had no shelter, and the scorched earth tactic is what we call that. The Tsar actually burned his own city and as a result managed to stop Napoleon at Moscow. It is usually heralded as a great military success and great strategy, etc., that Napoleon was stopped in Russia by this technique, and later on, of course, Wellesley defeated in Waterloo. That's a different story. An identical technique was employed by the Marathas, and in fact, this technique is employed 23 years prior to Napoleon actually employing it against, the Russians employing it against Napoleon. And you find that the Marathas under Nana Fadnis and Mahatji Shinde had employed the exact same technique against the East India Company in what is today known as, uh, still today known as Pimpri Chinchwad and Talegaon villages near the city of Pune. They are now actually towns. Uh, so the Marathas, in fact, similarly set the granary at Talegaon on fire that destroyed the food sources at Pimpri and Chinchwad. And so when the invading party, that is the East India Company, came all the way down the Ghat from Mumbai, and they were desperate for supplies because it used to take 10-15 days to cross the Ghats in those days, which normally today takes 2 hours by car. It used to take a good fortnight to cross the entire route, and they were short of supplies. They were banking on reaching the villages and then resupplying themselves. It was a common practice in those days that you stop at the villages and purchase whatever you want. Um, the kind of nationalism that your villagers themselves will not provide any secure, I thought still crept in. Um, it was normal practice to stop at a village, purchase supplies for army, and then move on forward. But this itself was thwarted. As a result, the East India Company got defeated, and it was one of the rare defeats that they faced in India. In fact, it was if the Marathas had pushed at that point, they could have in fact invaded Mumbai itself. But it didn't happen. But it was a stellar victory for them. Another point, if we see, is that of Peshwa Bajirao. We find that at a time when cartography was very limited, uh, your surveying, triangulation, all this was still in the future. And in fact, it would be still about 100 years in the future when maps were largely inaccurate, out of scale. He managed to strategize over 1,000 square miles of area. He managed to strategize battles which were fought and brought into contention Delhi, Satara, Bhopal, which are actually 1,000 miles apart from each other, and then devise, besieging and cutting off supply routes and such things. I've covered it in 3 or 4 chapters in my book as to how Peshwa Bajirao managed to, in fact, thought many designs by encircling its enemies and cutting off supply routes and cutting off roads that were 300, 400 miles apart. He had excellent view of the country uh, without having the modern map making techniques at his disposal. Managed to imagine over such a huge area is something quite fascinating. So yes, I would say that these are 3, 4 instances where you find that Indian rulers had their own qualities and something that we can emulate.
So, in one of the books I wrote, Narada, the Making of a Statesman, Sun Tzu's work is the art of war is very much talked about in the world, but people do not know that the Sun Tzu's work is actually Kanik's instructions to Dhritarashtra, and which is a very negative Machiavellian politics. It's not a good way of fighting a war. That's how that is what Dhritarashtra is taught by Kanik. But actually, Narad Muni gives another talk to Yudhishthir, which is the actual how to rule. And he asks 112 questions, and I put it in the book, Narada, the Making of a Statesman, which was independently reviewed by many American as well as Indian politicians. Now, in that book, Narad Muni says that when the enemy is weak, we have to continuously keep them engaged or completely defeat them, like so that they don't rise again. So and I see Shivaji Maharaj following a lot of those techniques, where he would, like you said just now, he would make alternate ways to make sure that the enemies are not rising again and again from the same place. But today's politicians, and somehow it is being taught to them that that we follow a dharma, and we do not the platform of dharma is what Narad is telling to Yudhishthir, where the enemy is weak, you have to defeat them or create so many problems for the enemies that they don't rise against you again and again to protect dharma. But today's politicians, they have made a totally अधार्मिक एक्शन, हमने किसी पे आक्रमण नहीं किया, हम किसी पे आक्रमण नहीं करते, भारत ने कभी किसी से आक्रमण नहीं किया. All this nonsense they talk about, and these are the big leaders of the society. So what it actually does is it creates Stockholm syndrome, which is already Hindus are suffering from. Stockholm syndrome. Most of the Hindus have been told that enemies are very strong, but it usually gets debunked. Like the Chinese theory got debunked, and the Pakistan theory got debunked. But if you look at countries like America, they don't hesitate. If they feel that the war should be kept out of United States, they do it. They fight in another country so that the war doesn't come to the country. And Narad Muni said the same thing, that keep the enemy engaged in their territory. They should not come to your territory. So, so if you look at from the Dharma point of view, where are we missing?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, Chhatrapati Shivaji, Shivaji Maharaj probably had a very deep understanding of both the Ramayana and Mahabharata.
Exactly. I can see that. When you say that, I can see that because he is actually following the Shastra.
Yes. In fact, there are some very good talks on the internet. In fact, one by a renowned historian, the late Ninathrao Bedekar. It's in Marathi, unfortunately.
No, I am
But-
from Maharashtra. It's not unfortunate. This is true.
No, unfortunately, in the sense that nobody else can understand what is being said.
My grandmother used to tell a joke, and it's just a joke. She used to say in Marathi, she used to tell me that when Punjabis were doing Bhangra, Shivaji Maharaj conquered the whole North India. When Punjabis were doing, that's what she used to say. It's a joke. So viewers don't take it offensive. We have a lot of friends from all sides. Yes, go ahead.
So, it's the talk essentially is on how Chhatrapati Shivaji emulated the philosophy of Sri Krishna. And in fact, you see a lot of examples that kind of philosophy that was espoused by Sri Krishna is put in practical practice. Is put in practical practice by Shivaji Maharaj. So, he understands that trying to sometimes being a straight arrow isn't going to help. The straight trees are cut first. It's the first lesson that Shivaji Maharaj learned from Sri Krishna. And a lot of things that we are all arguing, was it correct that he called Afzal Khan for a meeting, then he stabbed him, and how correct is that? But you have to understand Afzal Khan did the same thing to a Karnataka ruler, a ruler in Karnataka about 20 years prior to this event, in 1637 or 1638. Yet it done exactly the same thing. So nothing wrong in this. Again, he also follows this diktat in that Pratapgarh campaign, which I have covered that book, that to fight at the border. You don't wait for them to come inside, which is again something that is a failure in North India in some cases. Yes, there were border fights. There were fights in Peshawar. There were fights at the Indus. But then you find that there is the first battle of Panipat, which is obviously at Panipat. Then there is the second battle of Panipat, which is again at Panipat. And then there is a third battle of Panipat. And Panipat is a long, long way inside. You have to cross the entire Hindu Kush, cross the whole of what is today's Pakistani Punjab, cross the whole of what is today's Indian Punjab, reach all the way to Haryana, and then reach Panipat. So, a lot of cases they find that Shivaji Maharaj does in fact emulate the Shastras, and has a deep knowledge of what is being actually taught in the Mahabharata and Ramayana.
Yeah, so that is the main reason why British banned Mahabharata, because if Mahabharata is taught in the schools, then people are naturally going to have more self-respect, and nobody will accept the nonsense taught by the colonial rulers.
In fact, the word Machiavellian is perhaps more popular, and Nicholas Machiavelli is popular than Chanakya. That is an unfortunate situation. But in fact, his book, The Prince, is basically about politics. It's just about power, how to gain power, what are the ways of gaining power, and all that he can talk about is wrapped up in 120, 130 pages in whatever translation available. The Arthashastra, on the other hand, is about statecraft and runs at 800 pages. Both the translations are easily available, but the Arthashastra is a huge book, and it talks about a lot of things. It, of course, talks about politics also. It talks about how to run the state, how to gain power, how to keep power, who are enemies, who are supposed to be our friends. And it goes into the topic so much more deeply But when you talk about politics, there's more chance of people knowing about Nicholas Machiavelli rather than Chanakya, which is an unfortunate situation.
So Nicholas Machiavelli's politics is just like Dhritarashtra's discussion with Kanika. Kanika's advice to Dhritarashtra. Because I studied all
Exactly.
these works, I saw them, and the Arthashastra of Chanakya, because he compiled it, he did not write it. So again, he was a student of Mahabharata and Ramayana, which was this Chanakya says, and so he expanded on all these things and go get into detail. So see, Indian foreign policy also is very defensive in nature. Somehow, I was hearing it in yesterday. They never took example of Shivaji Maharaj. They don't teach that in the Indian foreign service. Actually, they don't teach the Battle of Saragadi. They don't teach the Shivaji Maharaj or Bajirao Peshwa II's war strategies. They don't discuss that. But in the British military school, which is a Royal Marine School, they teach all these things. It's so surprising that a country which is colonized India studies and teaches these things. American Marine School teaches them, but Indian schools don't teach them. It goes beyond my
Exactly.
mind. I saw the curriculum of the US Marines. I live very close to their office here in San Diego, just 30 minutes away from me. And I saw their curriculum, and they have all these case studies, ancient Marathan case studies, and ancient case studies of even goes to Saragadi, because the British call it the ultimate last man story, last man standing story, because
Yeah.
21 people defended against 4,000 attackers. Actually, 4 to 21,000 attackers. So it's
Yeah.
unfortunate that. So, what are the key aspects in your book that you think can actually change the mindset of the politicians in India and also the educationists?
Yeah. So key aspect basically, as I said, they are pivotal battles, and I try to explain as to why they are pivotal, why they are game changing, um, and what really makes those people great is through these battles. I mean, it is, you can say it's like trying to understand Sachin Tendulkar by watching 10 of his best innings, which is actually a good way of trying to learn. So same way, I mean, why is Chhatrapati Shivaji great? So I was trying to explain because he had great strategic acumen and this that. Uh, I tried to show the entire battle as a whole, went about where Chhatrapati Shivaji's greatness really comes through in this strategy. In Pratapgarh, he is facing a formidable enemy. He reached a situation where he's surrounded on four sides, and he comes out of that something really great. Peshwa Bajirao, again, we see how it is, he manages to strategize over huge areas of land and again come out on top. Further on, you find even Maharji Shinde, then the Maratha army is now modernizing slowly. Then the battles are different. We find places like Laswari where the British are very lucky. The East India Company actually got very lucky in some of these battles. Um, Last minute, we find that the Marathas, this is one blunder they committed, that they put their leadership in the hands of French and Scott officers, and they deserted at the last moment, giving victory to the East India Company. We had situations where one contingent of the Marathas did not fight the battle at all. Uh, so you can give throughout as to where, in what conditions, what ways, what are the qualities that enabled them to win. Uh, the curriculum doesn't cover any of this battle actually. And then I also covered as to what made the Marathas lose against East India Company, because eventually they lost. So that is also important for us to know as to where they fell short and they finally lost to a superior force under the Duke of Wellington. And so these are the kind of aspects which can be covered. Yes.
So, thank you so much, Anish ji, for coming on the show today and sharing your thoughts on your book. And is your book available on Amazon?
Yes, yes. In fact, both my books are available now. The earlier one was on Lachit Barphukan, who was the Assamese commander and he defeated the Mughals at the Battle of Sarai Ghat. Sarai Ghadi is in Punjab, Sarai Ghat is in Assam.
Hmm.
So, yeah. So, this it's called Brahmaputra. It's available on Amazon Kindle. And also, Battle of the Maratha Empire is also available on Amazon Kindle. So both the books are available. Yes.
And for viewers who you would like to get those books, get it from Amazon. And if you're in the West, in India, is it available from another publication?
No, but in India the paperback is also available. So,
Okay.
but outside the paperback isn't available.
Okay. So viewers, thank you for watching this, and it's a very important need to learn the right history and debunk the old thoughts. And sometimes if you want to make India a Vishwaguru, you need Bahubal, because just by Gyan, nobody appreciates you. They steal your Gyan. So the India, all the Western colonialists, they came to India, conquered it, stole everything, because people, if you do not defend yourself, then the knowledge belongs to the person who conquered you. Like just like your numerals are now claimed by the Persians, Iranians, as they invented it because they conquered you. So you may claim to the whole world that it belongs to us, nobody's going to listen to you, because this world is a very hard place. It belongs to a place who shows military strength, and that's why you see that people, the economy also grows. I'm just telling you from history that whichever country has conquered other places or shown a strong military who can take decisive actions, those countries have controlled power and business and education all over the world. That is the history. And if you do not learn from history, it's going to repeat again. So we have also seen that India was the richest country in the world when Indian military force was expeditionary. And like my friend says, dharmocracy. Like other countries are exporting democracy, India has to export dharmocracy. So because that's philosophy has to be exported, and wherever there is adharma, we have to send it out. And it is not possible without a proper war strategy. Otherwise, the dream of Vishwaguru will remain a dream. Thank you and namaskar.
Thank you. Thanks.